Welcome, I'm Michael Bickert. Thanks for joining me today as we explore concepts with the objective of improving your management skills and growing your business. Grab that notepad, grab a pen. I want you to take notes, and I want you to make a commitment to yourself that you will jot down at least one thing, one action item that you will implement in your business today, because that's what this is all about. We need to implement things in our business and drive those businesses forward. Today, I want to talk to you about negotiation skills. Someone recently approached me and asked me for some tips on negotiation, and I thought, hey, that's something I maybe should record a video on and share with all of you. So I hope you'll take some notes. Now, what I'll endeavor to do is I will create a free download with some of the tips that I go through today and everything, so you can reference that. And we'll put that in the link in the description. And all you'll have to do is enter a name and email address, and then you'll be able to download that for free. But still, I want you to think as we go through this process, even though you're going to have the notes and you can get those on your own, I want you to think of something that you can jot down, that you can implement, that is relevant to your business. Maybe it's not about, a tip on how to be a better negotiator. Maybe it is something that you think, hey, maybe I should be negotiating in that situation. I've never thought of that before. So how we're gonna frame today's discussion is, first I'm gonna talk about, sort of the who to negotiate with, and then we'll talk about sort of the principles behind negotiation and the tips for negotiating and becoming a better negotiator. This is a process. And, I brainstormed a little bit about, what kind of tips and what things I've observed and experienced over the years as a negotiator or in negotiations. And there's going to be a lot of things that I miss and skip, and you can weigh in on the discussion in the comments and let us know if you have some other tips that we can follow. So let's start with when or who would I negotiate with? Well, ultimately the answer to that question in business is your stakeholders, your business stakeholders. This is not just about negotiating with a customer. And in fact, of course, that is one of your stakeholders, your customer. So you will occasionally negotiate with your customer. And that doesn't mean that you're necessarily negotiating price. When you're engaged in sales in some way, you're trying to be persuasive, you're trying to influence, and it may be that it's the delivery or there's something else that makes up the value equation that you are negotiating with the customer to make it make sense for you. And this depends on your type of business, of course. So some of you who may be retailing specific items that are priced, have set prices, you can't think of ever negotiating with a customer, and that's fine. Others of you, maybe, you have set prices and you quote, maybe you have a contracting business or a healthcare facility of some kind, and prices aren't for negotiation. But what other concessions are customers asking for from you that you might be able to make to improve the value equation, to improve the convenience for them or their experience? And you might say, well, that's not a negotiation if I just concede those things. But what I'm really getting at is what forms or constitutes a need for negotiation is when one of the other stakeholders that you're engaging with is asking for something that you have been previously unprepared to give or acquiesce for some reason. And you may start to think of that. And then negotiation typically, and what we're going to mostly focus on today, is that negotiation that takes place synchronously and probably in person, not necessarily. It may take place over the telephone, it may take place over email, but it's much more direct. But sometimes a negotiation takes place over a long period of time. It depends on how you define negotiation, and start to think and brainstorm of, going back to my previous definition of something that you may have been unwilling to do or offer that another stakeholder is looking for. It might be some kind of perk or benefit or improvement in their situation, and you think, well, there's something I would like from that other stakeholder, and so what could I ask them for? And then we could kind of, how we could both come together in the middle and have a melding of the mind, so to speak. So stakeholders in general, customers, of course. What about your business partners? Perhaps you are operating with a group of partners or other shareholders in your organization, maybe even family members or a spouse who's involved, and you think of things differently, and maybe one of you sort of has the final say. That's very common. Maybe one of you operates as the president or general manager and has the final say on how things are going to operate, but you should consider, is there a negotiation here? Is there some middle ground that you can both? So a business partner might be any of your employees, your management team, your front line, and we talked about customers, but of course prospective customers. In order to make a lead a customer, you may need to negotiate. The same thing is true with prospective employees. You may need to negotiate remuneration when you're trying to attract attract and acquire new talent for your team. So there may be a negotiation that goes on there. What other, your vendors is a great one. Your suppliers, those people who sell materials and things to you to help you operate your business, those things that you need to operate your business, is there a negotiation that is possible there? And consider what you've done in the past to secure those items. Did you just pay the price and just follow the terms of that vendor? Maybe there's something that person or that vendor was willing to do for you that you hadn't considered even asking, but it would have improved your situation as a customer. So these are the primary, another stakeholder I often reference when I talk about the list of stakeholders is your surrounding community. Your surrounding community is a stakeholder in your business, and there may be opportunities to negotiate with that. Now I think of things like when there's regulations, perhaps you are doing some sort of facility or structure, and it's going to impact the environment, it's going to impact the landscape and the visual appeal of a particular neighborhood or whatever, and you have to maybe go to city council or whatever to state your case, and there may be a bit of a negotiation involved there with your surrounding community, even your government regulators and that kind of thing. I know that there was a great deal of, there's an extreme example, but a great deal of negotiation between Tesla and the German government for Giga Berlin, and they proceeded amidst those negotiations with construction plans, even though they hadn't had all of the concessions they were looking for as a company. So you can think of all the various stakeholders they may want to negotiate with. Now let's go into, in no particular order, the principles behind negotiation and the associated tips that take advantage of some of these principles and will make you a better negotiator. And try these things. What I'd like you to do, maybe that's what you're going to implement. Today you're going to try one of these techniques, and you're going to see if it has the desired effect. I think the first thing I would recommend to you as it relates to negotiation is to seek win-win situations. That's the most important thing. Often you engage in a negotiation and you think a bit you think of it as a battle, and that you've got to win. You've got to try to win. But in fact, win-win is the only acceptable solution, and you should sincerely think that way. You need to understand this, and you need to spend some time on this concept alone if you don't accept that. This video isn't going to be all about win-win, but I can tell you this: if you seek win-lose, like you are going to win the negotiation at the expense of the other person, long-term, that will not work. You will end up, first of all, in your career and business in general, you will fail. You need to think win-win. You need to engage your stakeholders wanting for their success as well. And that should be the only way you go into any negotiation. Stop here, don't go any further until you accept this principle. Once you do, you will become a much better negotiator. You know, an example might be, I used your vendor. You're negotiating with your vendor. Do you really want to beat up your vendor on price in such a way that he's not profitable? And if that's the case, you've over-negotiated your hand, and you won't be a valuable customer to that supplier. They will be like, well, we don't really care about if this customer goes away, and you might not get the service or whatever. So people are short-sighted in their negotiations, thinking win-lose. The other equally unacceptable is lose-win. Do not allow somebody to take advantage of you in such a way that you just acquiesce all the time. That is destined for failure as well, because you will eventually, gain contempt for that situation, and you'll want out of that relationship. So always, always, always seek win-win. The other one, of course, both of these first two concepts come from the 7 habits of highly effective people, and we're trying to make you a more effective manager, a more effective negotiator. The second tip you want to follow is to seek first to understand and then be understood. And what is meant by that is you need to be empathic. You want to understand. I'm going to refer to the person you're negotiating with, the stakeholder, as your opponent. And I don't really mean it in the strict sense of the word, but in the negotiation, there's someone opposing you and in your viewpoint or your position in some way. So we'll refer to them in this discussion as the opponent, but really this could be a friend, this could be somebody very close to you, this could be even a spouse, and you don't want to think of them as opponents in general, but so forgive the term, I guess is what I'm saying here. But you want to be empathic to your opponent, and you want to understand their position. By doing so, you will become that much more likely to gain the position you're looking for, because you can, first of all, you'll be that much more likely to come to an agreement at least. You may acquiesce in a way that you go, oh, you know what, that's a good point they're making. I want to see it that way. You don't want to be hung up on something that you fail to realize that they have a very strong position on a particular point that just you were unaware of. So seek first to understand, then be understood. Find out as much as you can about your opponent. Also, again, I forgive the terminology, but that becomes ammunition. So as you are finding out more and more about the person or the organization with whom you are negotiating, you will find ways to ammunition that you can use to close later, and you can point that stuff out to them. And maybe as we go through some of these tips, it'll become a little bit more apparent. But be empathic. That's very important. And your opponent will feel that, and they are much more likely to acquiesce and concede on points that will help your position out if they see that you are also doing that. They will want to understand your position. People do not care how much you know until they know how much you care. And so by you showing them that you care about their position, you care about a win-win situation, then they also start to sort of embrace that. It's far less adversarial. The next tip is I want you to think long-term, and that's related to all of the other stuff we're talking about here. It's a principle of negotiation. Think long-term. Sometimes people are so competitive and caught up in winning the negotiation, so to speak, that they have a very short-sighted outlook here. And there may be a whole bunch of reasons that you don't want to have your final position. Maybe you started off at one thing that you wanted and you're like, I'm gonna fight to the bitter end on this in this negotiation, and my definition of winning is to get all of these points that I want or whatever. But sometimes those things are short-sighted and they're not good for you long-term. And you may, lose out on a customer or something. Just, it depends on the situation. If we use the example of acquiring talent for your team, and you really had stuck in your mind a budget that you had to pay for a salary or what have you, and then you failed to think long-term, and you thought, well, you know what, if 2 years from now this person is very successful for our organization, what they're asking for would be very reasonable. So that's more of a long-term perspective. And so then what you can do is in the negotiation, you can suggest concessions that, well, okay, we could probably give you what you're looking for there under these conditions. So we could put these performance bonuses in place or whatever that would give you what you're looking for, and you find a way. You want to be creative and think long term. I guess those are two separate tips. Be creative in trying to find a way to bridge those gaps, but think long term. Don't think of this as this particular discussion, this negotiation that is occurring right now as being the only thing. It matters long term. Another one is you want to be prepared to walk away. There's that famous scene in Seinfeld where George goes and helps Jerry buy a car from Putty at the dealership, and George is the king of the walk away. He's like, we'll walk right now. So there is merit to that. You don't want to have any attachment to outcomes. You want to sort of go into your negotiation. It's a strength position to be, you know what, if it doesn't work out, that's fine. I want a win-win situation. I'm going into this empathically. I'm going to understand what their position is, but I know what I can and can't do. And I'll walk away if it doesn't work. I'll just have to, it'll be unfortunate. I'd really like to make a deal here, but I am prepared to walk from this. That is leverage. If you're unprepared to walk away, it better not be revealed to your opponent. If someone is negotiating with you and they know you can't afford to walk away from this deal, they're gonna hold their ground. So you may have to bluff that you are prepared to walk away, but that's not my advice. The best tip is that you are prepared. That whole thing about not being attached to a particular outcome, it's like, well, I really, really would like this. I really want this deal to come together, but if it doesn't, maybe it wasn't meant to be, and there might be something better down the road. There are always new opportunities. Go into it with that attitude, and that will give you strength in the negotiation. One other note on walking away, and I've used this time and again in negotiations, is it sounds like a bluff, but again, it's sincere, is sometimes I walk away with the intention of I'm going to return if I don't have another opportunity. Maybe you're like, I really want this deal, but not every time during the negotiation, if you walk away, is it a completely dead deal. You can return to the negotiating table at some other point. And you might say, okay, well, what I'll often use is I will say to the person that I'm negotiating with, all right, well, your position may be good, it may be fair and everything, but I haven't done all the research and homework that I need to do on this. So I think I'm gonna leave it for now. Thank you very much. I'm not gonna proceed. I'm gonna shop around. I'm gonna see what my other options are, what other opportunities there are out there for me. Now, the degree to which your opponent really wants your business, that sometimes has an immediate effect where they go, well, you know what, how about, could we just do this today? And they make a concession at the point. So from that point of view, it sounds like maybe it's a bit of a bluff or a psychological technique, and that's fine. But I'm sincere when I do it. It's like, you know what, I haven't. There are other options out there. I'd like to explore these a little bit more. And you never know what happens. You don't know what the response is going to be at that point. So be prepared to walk away. And in fact, walk away from the table and then come back to it later. And then you can come back to it and you might think, well, I'm in a weaker position if I come back. That may be true. It's often true. If you come back, the person's like, but you may realize, wow, this was a pretty good deal. And you might have reframed the opponent's position in your mind and go, you know what? I probably should have taken that deal. And that's part of the negotiation. It's not a loss. It's part to that win-win. And so the tip is not only being prepared to walk away, but do walk away with the realization that most times you can come back to it. And often that results in a concession from your opponent. Another really important principle of negotiation that I would advise you is to never damage the relationship in favor of the win. So again, some people they fancy themselves these wonderful negotiators, and it's all about winning the negotiation so they can boast about it later, and it damages the relationship. You don't want that in business. You don't want to have bad relationships, a sour taste left in the mouth of the other stakeholder. Remember, these are your customers, your prospective customers, your employees, your business partners, your vendors. You want to have good relationships. The relationship is important. Now, there may be a situation where you're involved in a negotiation that is at the termination of a relationship. And it's like, what are the terms of us breaking up this relationship entirely? And so there could be an exception to the rule. But even then, I would say in life in general, life is too short to have enemies. So try not to damage the relationship. Remember, everybody's acting in his own self-interest, and that person's position is likely not unreasonable in their mind. And so just proceed with the idea that the relationship comes first and winning the negotiation is secondary. I've related a story in another video in which I went to work for an organization, and the person who hired me mentioned that he had spoke to my previous employer and was told that I was a great closer. And you might say, well, a great closer means he's a great negotiator. And in that story, I always like to share this information. I spent the time building relationships with my customers, which made me such a good closer because I could get away with things based on the relationship, based on all the emotional deposits that I had with those people that I had the relationships I was building with. Later, when it came to closing the deal, making a sale, both of us wanted it because we valued the relationship more than any particular point or over price or something like that. It was more important for both of us. We both wanted a desired outcome of a closed sale. So spend the time to build your relationship prior to the negotiation. If you just come into a situation with someone and you try to negotiate right out of the bat, again, this is the whole thing where seek first to understand and then be understood. You've got no rapport, no relationship with them. They are an adversary. They maybe truly are an opponent. But in most cases, your stakeholders, you'll get an opportunity to build some relationship, build some rapport, some common ground, some empathy, and that'll be very, very beneficial to you when it comes to closing any deal and being successful in any negotiation. WIFM or WIIFM, what's in it for me? Remember, that's the question. Since we all act in our own self-interest, that's the question everyone is always asking himself. So answer that question as you present your case in any negotiation. Answer the question of what's in it for your opponent to reach a deal with you. You know, you might say, and then what we would have is you would make all this profit. I know that maybe it's not great for you right out of the gates, but I'm a long-term customer. I'll sign the contract and you'll make money from me over time, and you'll get referrals, and I'll give you, you start making a case of what's in it for them. It may not be obvious. There are some things that you may have gathered when you sought first to understand that you're like, I know this is important to you, and here's something dealing with me or my organization is going to do for you that I know is important to you. Answer the question, what's in it for me, that the opponent in your negotiation is asking himself. The degree to which you do that will strongly influence the success of your negotiation skills. So make a presentation. You're trying to be influential here. You're trying to persuade somebody to see things your way. That means you have to see things their way, and you have to present your case and let them know what's in it for them. Think about this phrase, if you don't ask, you don't get. And I think that's something that you might want to bear in the back of your mind during a negotiation. Ask for everything you want. There's no point in leaving it inside unless it's something offensive or something completely unreasonable. But I would advise you to ask for everything you want in the negotiation. If you don't ask, you don't get. Nobody's going to come out of there and go, hey, and by the way, we're also going to throw in this. I'm also going to give you this benefit that you didn't even ask for. So anything that's important to you in the negotiation, you need to put on the table and ask for it. And some of these things may be, nice to have. Others may be deal breakers. Some of these things may be where, you're just not negotiable on. And you should maybe state that. You should let people know where you stand from the beginning and put all your cards on the table. Maybe you're not. In the cards analogy, you keep some of your cards close to your vest, I suppose. You don't want to show your whole hand, but as it relates to what you want to get those things out. Every now and then, somebody might advise you a good thing to do is to ask for something near the end that you want. And that may be different than, that's not at odds with the idea of asking for everything you want, because you're still in the negotiation. I'm not saying you have to ask for everything up front, but you need to, in the negotiation, ask for everything at some point. The other thing is there's a psychology in negotiation. So this is not news to you. Probably shoot for a little higher than what it is you're actually willing to, settle on. So go for more, because the psychology is the person is going to be hoping that you'll make some sort of concession. So, you've heard of, well, I'll meet you in the middle and this kind of thing. If you sort of stated your best and final offer up front, there's nowhere to go from that. And the psychology that I'm referencing here is that your opponent would like to see that you made some sort of concession. They're not the only ones making concessions for giving you everything you want. So ask for more than what you want, and then you can make some concessions and get back to what it is that you must have to make it a good deal. You know, sort of, but be careful, don't overplay your hand. Don't ask for too much. Sometimes you ask for the ridiculous and the person just goes, you know what, forget about this. This is unreasonable. And if you do that, then you got to say, okay, is that unreasonable? I didn't realize it was, you gotta have to backpedal a little bit there. So don't ask for too much. As you're nearing the end of the negotiation, you have to ask a closing questions. You have to go for the close. So the technique I would advise you is you have to ask a closing question very directly, such as, will that work for you? Or do we have a deal? Something along those lines. And then you have to follow the technique that I used to call the hockey puck technique. And we gave a hockey puck award to remind people to put it on their desk to, once you've asked your closing question in your negotiation, shut the hockey puck up. Shut the puck up. Do not speak next. We used to say, he who speaks first loses. Once you've asked the question that is meant to close the deal, then be silent and let the person respond to your closing question. The only exception to that rule is if for some reason they didn't understand it, it was maybe a little vague, maybe you actually didn't ask it loud enough and they didn't actually hear you, you were talking over one another. These things do happen, so the only exception is you can restate the question. And it's okay to rephrase the question because it might have been a little vague about what you were really asking. It shouldn't be. You want to come up with closing questions for good negotiations that make sense and are very obvious, that don't require a lot of clarity, and then shut the hockey puck up and let the person answer. And as long as the silence is there, use that awkward silence in your favor. People don't like awkwardness. So this is another tip, is I want you to embrace the awkwardness. Do not eschew or avoid the silence or the awkwardness that comes up in negotiation. The degree to which you're comfortable with that and your opponent is not will give you the edge. So people don't like to just sit there staring at each other. So you've asked for the close and now you're just quiet and you're staring. It gets awkward. Very quickly, it feels like an eternity. And people, to break the awkward silence, sometimes they just acquiesce and they say yes. It's a very effective technique, so make sure you try that one. There are some, I guess, physical techniques that you can use and use your body language and your facial expressions to favor you. These are getting more subtle, but this is very effective, I'm telling you. So, you know, I would want you to have a pleasant demeanor and I want you to have a bit of a smile on your face, but you don't want to have an awkward look that makes it look like you're kidding if you ask that question. But here's a real good physical tip to give you, especially, I guess only if you're negotiating face-to-face in person, is extend a hand for a handshake along with your closing question. All right, sounds like we have a deal. We got a deal? And then you extend your hand for the handshake. People, again, are just conditioned to shake your hand. And then once they're shaking your hand, sometimes they shake your hand and they haven't really mentally agreed yet, but now it's awkward and they're like, oh, okay, let's move forward with it. That's a little tip and it can pay dividends, so try that. I mentioned a moment ago to be pleasant in your demeanor. Remember, we're not losing any relationships over this. Check, this is the important tip, check the emotions at the door. You know, do not get all stressed out over this. This is not personal. This is business. And I've seen people where they just get angry. I've seen on both sides of negotiations where it gets so emotional, it's not going anywhere. You need to check your emotions at the door. If you see the other person is getting really emotional, what you should do is try to relieve that tension in some way and bring things down a little bit. There's a difference between allowing the awkwardness to favor you and your negotiation skills than what I'm referring to here is when a person is getting emotionally charged where they don't like you anymore. You're not going to win a negotiation with somebody who doesn't like you. It's going to be lose-lose. In fact, both of you will lose the negotiation. So remain pleasant. Try to think of it as a game, as a process. You know, there are games, many games, most games are a bit of a negotiation, or there's a lot of negotiating, and Monopoly has negotiation. In Risk, there is a lot of strategy and sometimes negotiation that goes on. And you want to, as we said, check the emotions at the door. And when you think of something as a game and it's like, you know, this is not worth getting too upset about, then you will be the stronger negotiator there. Another tip is to use suggestion statements. So I talked about the closing question. Another way to do that, and sometimes you do both, but another way to do that is to use a closing statement. Like, here's what we should do. I'll tell you what, this is what we'll do. So you see, I start with the statement, and so here's what we'll do. We'll set it up for Monday delivery. We'll go ahead with the price that we're talking there, and we'll whatever. You know, you make the suggestion, and then you can just follow up with the closing. Sound good? And extend the hand. Do we have a deal? And so think of these things. Make those statements, those suggestive statements. That puts you in a position, again, there's some psychology behind it, that you are consultative. You are making a recommendation. You are trying to get a release of the tension and the awkwardness by making a statement that everybody wins. And everything comes together at that point. Your facial expression, your confidence in your voice, all of those things. And that's a tip. Make sure you're confident. Try to be confident. Another thing that I've used is a ridiculous term. Now, what I don't mean by that, earlier I said, you know, don't ask for too much. If you're asking for something completely ridiculous, then you might sort of offend the person and they go, well, this is unreasonable. Forget about it. That's not what I mean here. What I'm talking about is something that's really trivial, ridiculously trivial. So I've done things like say to the person, you know, I'm thinking about it, and I go, you know what? All right, I'll do the deal, but here's what you have to do. And then I throw out a term that they have to concede to that I know for sure it's not a big deal, but it's a little bit silly. So I might say, but you have to buy me lunch, and I'm gonna get the club sandwich, and you know what? All you can eat dessert or whatever. Something ridiculous in the situation. It's like, okay, I'll do this, but you got to buy me lunch. And I can think of lots of examples of where you might do this. Try this technique. This is when you've already in your mind decided, yeah, let's just move forward with it. But then you add that, and it just releases some of that tension, especially if things were getting a little bit awkward and people were like, I don't know, and maybe you're worried it was damaging the relationship or whatever. This brings it back to where it adds some levity to the situation. You're lighthearted, and the other person is likely to sort of breathe a sigh of relief and go, you know what? Okay, I'll throw in the lunch. Another one I've done is, okay, I'm gonna do this for you, but I'm gonna need you to give me a 5-star Google review. That's the only way I'm gonna move forward with this deal. And they think of that as, oh boy, that's easy. Yeah, I'll be happy if you do this deal for me and I'm content with your product or service, I'm happy to give you a good review. And that technique is related to something that I would really advise you to do, which is known as the courtesy bump. When you use the courtesy bump is in a negotiation where you've decided mentally you're prepared to move forward. The offer being presented to you by your opponent is reasonable, and you're like, you know what? I'm willing to go there. I think we'll do the deal. However, you use the courtesy bump again because of psychology. If you just agree to the terms, there is this psychology and this tendency for your opponent to go, oh, maybe I could have asked for more and gotten more. Maybe that was not the place I left money on the table, or I left things on the table, so to speak. The courtesy bump takes that and alleviates that tension from the other person's mind. So, you know, it might have been price, it might have been some perks that somebody was looking for, some benefits to employment that somebody is working into their negotiation, and it's all good for me, and I decide, and then I ask for them to come my way a little bit more in the negotiation, but I do a very small amount that I know they'll agree to, or that they're likely to agree to. The courtesy bump is very effective in avoiding and mitigating against buyer's remorse and that psychological phenomenon where people think, oh, I probably could have done better on my side. If they were the last one to make a concession, then it shows that they found your bottom, so to speak, your bottom line. So use the courtesy bump. That's really an effective technique. So the last tip I want to give you is to consider your peace of mind and the value of your time in the negotiation. Don't get so hung up on winning the negotiation that you lose sight of the long term. Again, this is related to that concept of long term and not damaging relationship and everything. And even if you're thinking of it as a game, sometimes we get so hung up in the moment that it's like, what am I doing? We just need to move on. This is such a small point here. I could just acquiesce and move on. I've seen it time and again where negotiations go bad, or that people, they think they've won a negotiation, but in fact they've lost, they won the battle, lost the war, because they didn't put any value on their time or peace of mind, and they got hung up on something because it was, some perceived principle, but it was a really weak principle. It wasn't really something they should have been hung up on. So don't get involved in those proverbial peeing contests because you're digging in your feet, you're digging in your heels, and both of you just don't want to lose. That's not worth your time. So those are the tips that I brainstormed this morning, and I hope you got something out of it. Try to use one of these techniques today. In fact, if you weren't planning to be in a negotiation, think of all of your conversations in some way you're trying to persuade, you're trying to influence, and there's a bit of a negotiation component to just about all relationships. So try one of these techniques. Maintain that eye contact. I didn't say that, be confident. There's all sorts of other things. And I'd like to hear from you and know whether you've got anything out of this. And what techniques do you use for effective negotiating? And are we living in a world where negotiation is going away? I think as it relates to a lot of, the commerce, the financial aspects of the transaction, they are becoming less and less common, but negotiation and these skills can be applied in so many ways with so many stakeholders and in all relationships. Really, it's just about persuasion and influence. So put something in the comment, give us some tips that we can all learn from, because we need to learn from one another. Perpetual refinement.